Morning all. Welcome to these one slide, 5 minute Jekyll and Hyde revision videos. This is the first one, and I'm just going to run through an intro of this entire book and the author, and I'm going to try and do it in 5 minutes. Okay, so we're going to start off. Robert Louis Stevenson. He was brought up in Scotland. Think of him as quite a sort of sickly child. He was always in and out of bed. He was always being medicated for things. He found a huge amount of sanctuary in reading and writing. So from a very early age, he was writing and reading stories, but he had this kind of war going on between him and illness and sickness, which is a really important thing to remember because it features heavily in this book. He sort of pleased his dad and he became a lawyer. Again, that's quite relevant to this book because the main narrator in this, Utterson, he is a lawyer as well. So he sees law as a kind of like a powerful figure in society, someone who could be trustworthy. But he didn't really like that. He ended up traveling the world and sort of escaping that literary world and his father and his family. And he went off to America where he got married. But he got worse, he got more and more ill, he came back, he married again, and he ended up sort of hitting his literary writing prime when he got back, and he started writing his most famous work, which is Treasure Island, which I'm sure you've heard of, in 1884, and then Jekyll and Hyde 2 years later in 86. He actually wrote the book, and then his wife read it, and he mulled over whether he liked it or not, and he, in a really strange move, burnt the entire manuscript and rewrote the whole thing by hand in 3 days. And he was bedridden at the time. He was medicated on medical cocaine, and I don't think his head was particularly in the game. And then he wrote this masterpiece, and then, you know, not even 10 years later he died. So he ended up leaving to a remote Pacific island and died there at 44. Okay, so he had quite a troubled life, like on and off with medical problems and wrestling with literature the whole time. And that directly links into the big ideas in the story, which I'll talk about in a sec. For now, I think it's worth just knowing what was going on in Victorian England and Britain in the late 1800s. So much like a lot of Dickens's work and writers at the time, there was this huge focus on the inequalities in society. So you had cities, especially like Edinburgh and London, you had really two sides to the city. You had the rich, posh, establishment who, like Scrooge or like Jekyll, were living in a completely different world to the poor, like Cratchit in Christmas Carol, or in this case, the likes of Mr Hyde in Soho. There's kind of, think of it as two halves of the same coin. They really are completely starkly different, but in the same world, and you can get there literally in a few minutes by walking. At this time, like, the world changed hugely in terms of industry. Britain was hugely powerful because it was pumping out like industrial things like steam trains and factories. They were making huge advances in science, so they were really leading the way in the world. The empire was at its height. They owned a third of the world or something, and people like Charles Darwin were sort of reinventing what science was. He was suggesting that we evolved from apes, and that was in contrast to the religious side of life, which was that human was like created by God. So there was this huge like rocket explosion of ideas, scientific ideas. This guy Lombroso sort of suggested that people could have their brains looked at for potentially being criminals, that people actually had like a criminal gene that was in their brain that you could analyze. So all these big ideas were coming out about what human beings were and what humankind was. And actually, these ideas directly linked into this book. So Jekyll and Hyde, really, the big ideas are about those contrasts that I've mentioned, that duality, which just means two things, that you could be evil and good at the same time, which is exactly what this book's about, Jekyll and Hyde. That you can be a beautiful city that's really posh and really, really expensive streets and houses, but then also really downtrodden and forgotten about. That the establishment, they were called, these really rich, posh people, untouchable gentlemen, and they had a reputation to uphold. And they tried to avoid things like addiction and violence, and they repressed it, which means they kept it at bay. They kind of didn't want to even think about it or do it, but then they couldn't help but be lured into this world. So that's exactly what Hyde is. He's a kind of outlet for Jekyll in order to give in to that repressed feeling that he's got, that evil that was inside him, that nature of evil that's inside everyone, that he couldn't help but become addicted to. Okay, so that's just a quick overview. The next clips are going to be about the specific chapters, and I'll run through the big ideas and then some key quotes and then the main plot as well. Okay, thanks.